favorite things to do as a kid is just simply take a walk in the woods to notice all the branches on the trees and the textures on the bark, and also the wonderful, incredible clouds that are up in the sky. Hi, I'm Barry Teghtmeyer, and we are about to start a class called Painting in Gouache. Gouache may be new to some of you, but it has been around for thousands of years. It was used originally for illustrations, but we are going to be using it mainly for landscapes. So stick around and see if you can get a brush handy and possibly even some gouache if you have it. And we are going to embark on painting in gouache. When you use gouache, it has some of the same characteristics as acrylic and sometimes watercolor. It's a water media that has characteristics all of its own. We're going to learn to paint the elements within a landscape as you utilize staining, layering, and dry brushing. It will also introduce you to the techniques for painting everything from skies to rocks to mountains. Our agenda for this class includes looking at the difference between watercolor and gouache. We're going to spend some time looking at supplies. We're going to look at the work of Mike Hernandez, who is a gouache artist. We're going to explore the importance of paint consistency. We're going to look at painting skies with gouache. We're going to paint ground and grasses with gouache. We're going to learn how to create a value scale using gouache, painting rocks, and finally painting a mountain landscape. And at the end, we'll review and wrap up on some of the most important things. So on the top we have a gouache painting by Mike Hernandez, and on the bottom we have a watercolor painting by Matthew White. Most people are familiar with watercolor and how it is painted, but not necessarily familiar with gouache. Both are completely different when it comes to the techniques and the different ways that you paint them. Now let's discuss some of those differences. First of all, when you're looking at a gouache painting, the consistency of gouache is very thick. Watercolor tends to be very thin. When you're painting gouache, it takes less water. And actually, watercolor takes more water to paint. Gouache is a dark to light process where you generally start out with the darker colors laid down first and then do the lightest colors last, such as your white. With watercolor, you generally start out with the white of the paper, and you'll be going from light to dark. The technique I use for gouache, I generally cover my paper first with a process called staining. With watercolor, I try to leave some of the paper showing for white. In gouache, I use dry brushing to blend the colors and to soften the edges. And watercolor, use dry brushing for texture, like on the bark of a tree.
In gouache, you can fix mistakes by just painting over. That's one of the best things about gouache. In watercolor, you basically use your mistakes and just create something new. In gouache, you can use a tinted paper if you so desire, but you can also just use watercolor paper. In watercolor, you can only use white paper. Gouache is opaque, means that you can't see through it. Whereas watercolor is very transparent. With watercolor, you cannot re-wet the paper. However, you can lift and scrub if there's an area you would like to make lighter. With gouache, you can go back to the same painting a week later and reactivate the paint that's on your paper. It's always exciting to get to talk to another artist, and Mike Hernandez was very honored that I was going to utilize him in some of my classes. He has said, "As an artist, I strive to find the beauty in the unexpected. I like to think of it as reconstructing all of the puzzle pieces of reality." Since Mike Hernandez lives in California, he has the best of both worlds. He's not too far from the mountains, and he's also very close to the oceans. And he does a lot of paintings of both. Many of his paintings are done in plein air. That means he takes all of his supplies outdoors and paints in the fresh air. One thing that Mike Hernandez is very good at is creating textures using gouache. Looking at this painting, you can see how he created the bark on the side of the trees, as well as the leaves in the trees. Even though they are not extremely detailed, they show that there is a definite texture there. Oh, I get very jealous when I look at this photograph. Here's Mike painting on the shoreline, watching the waves hit the rocks, and how he is painting fairly small. He doesn't paint large paintings when he's in plein air because the light changes so quickly, and you want to be able to finish it within a certain amount of time. Sometimes plein air paintings are taken back to the studio and touched up, but the majority of them are done outside. And here is a painting similar to the one he was working on in the photograph. Once again, looking at the texture, look at how he created the colors in blocks. It's a lot like the Impressionists did. Again, not looking for detail, but allowing those colors to lay side by side in order to give the illusion of what it looked like at that specific moment. The most important supply that you're going to be needing for gouache painting is the paper. This is a Strathmore toned gray paper. It is 184 pounds, which means it's very thick. Has a slight tooth to it, a little bit of a texture. And also, you can use watercolor paper. This is Arches, 140 pound, and it is cold press. It also has a bit of a tooth to it. This is how I tape down my paper to the artboard. Using this tape, it is a Scotch Blue artist tape, and taping it around the edges so that the paper does not warp when you're using it. Now let's look at several different gouache sets, or how you can use gouache. This is probably my favorite, the one I use the most. This is a Gouache studio set. This specific set comes with gray. You're going to need more white, and this is a M. Graham & Company white gouache coming in a larger tube. This is a Hemi 24 color set, and I'll be honest, I have not used this yet, but I have heard some people that enjoy all the variety of colors. It comes with a palette, as well as some brushes, and each individual color comes in these little pudding cups. Another way to utilize gouache is in the designer tubes, just like you would with watercolor. These are Winsor Newton, and they come with 10 different colors. You can get many different sets. This is the palette that I bought to use when I'm doing plein air and using gouache. The area where you put the paint is ceramic, which is great. It cleans up really well, and I like how compact it is. It'll fit nicely in my backpack. Now let's look at brushes. I'm going to show you several different brushes. I think the important thing is to know that I use my brushes just for gouache, and I have other brushes that I use for watercolor. This is a Princeton 1/2 inch flat. The top of it is flat like this, and it's 1/2 inch wide, and that's generally how you're going to see them used. This one is an angled brush, same 1/2 inch, again from the Princeton Company, which I really like. This is a brush that came with my set. It is just a medium round, probably somewhere around an 8 or 9. Now you need to understand that brushes and the brush numbers are different with each company. This is a detail brush, and it's a Royal Landnickel Detail 0. I have some that are a 0.5 and a 0.10. These are water containers. You're going to want one for clean water and one for dirty water. When I'm teaching gouache classes, this is something that I do with every class. You're going to need a rectangular piece of paper taped down, and you're going to draw 4 rectangles inside it. Each of the rectangles you're going to label different. The first is tea, the second is coffee, the third is going to be cream, and the last one is going to be butter. And we're working on paint consistency, how much water you add each time. So I'm just going to start out with one color. And here, this is an ultramarine out of my set. When I get the paint, I swirl it, swirl it, swirl it, and then add it out to my mixing tray. Taking a little bit of water and adding it to it. Now I'm going to add a lot of water to it because for the first consistency, it is one that has a lot of water. Now you'll notice when I'm swirling it around that the water tends to drip and move. When I put it down on my little chart, it will do the same thing. So I'm just filling in my rectangle, and then when I lift it up, you can actually see the water move. That is tea consistency. Next, I'm going to take a little bit more of the paint and add it out in the mixing tray into the same area, in the same area of water. So I'm wanting to make it a little bit thicker. You'll notice when I put the paintbrush through it that it stays. It doesn't blend together like it did with the tea consistency. Taking the paint, I'm adding it into the next rectangle, which is for coffee. This is the coffee consistency. It's a little bit thicker, a little less water than with tea. You notice it still does run a little bit, but not as much as the tea did. Next is a cream consistency. This is probably the consistency that you're going to use the most. So I'm going to add plenty of paint out into the mixing tray to that water that I already have in that area. And you'll notice that when I lift up the mixing tray, it's not hardly moving at all. It's mostly paint. I like to wipe it off on the side of the mixing tray before I go and paint with it, because I don't have too much on my brush. I want to control that. When I'm adding it to my rectangle, notice how it controls. Notice how I'm able to paint nice straight lines and fill in an area very well. Finally, we're going to use the butter consistency. For the butter consistency, I go directly into the paint and fill my brush with it, and I wipe it off on the side. Now, dragging my brush across the side, this is what happens. It creates a texture. This butter consistency is what I use to do dry brushing with that I mentioned earlier. Let's start by painting some sky. You're going to need to have some paper ready to go, taped down onto a watercolor board or down to your table. And then you're also going to need a horizon line drawn across. Probably having a good resource photo that has sky and ground in it is going to be very helpful as well. Starting out, I'm going to add a lot of white to my palette because I know I'm going to need some. And generally, in my set, it only comes with a little tiny tube, and I used that up a long time ago. We're using a coffee consistency in that it's not extremely watery, but it has a lot of water in it. And we're going to stain the sky with this color. Remember, using gouache, you try to cover your paper in the area that you are painting first. So I've got this lighter blue that I'm covering on, and I also like to dip my brush just in the water and make that spread out a little bit more. Now as I start drawing my clouds, I'm going to mix up a little bit of the blue-gray here. That's going to become the shadow for the bottom of my clouds. Let me check to make sure that's right. That looks pretty good. And as I'm drawing that, I'm moving my flat brush kind of up and down and around just to create the shadow. Remember, I'm not painting the whole cloud. I'm painting the shadow that's on mostly the bottom of the cloud. Looking at my photo and also looking at clouds in general, clouds get smaller as they go back into the distance. So I've got some smaller clouds going as they get closer to the horizon line. Now I've mixed up some very light blue, and I'm going to paint the tops of those clouds. Still a light blue. It still has a lot of blue in it, even though this is a lighter value. And I want you to notice how I'm moving my brush back and forth, similar that I did with the blue-gray on the bottom for the shadow. And this just utilizes a nice way that gouache paint can create those areas, those blocks of color that we talked about earlier. Here are some more clouds that are closer to the horizon, and again, very, very, very small. And now I'm taking pure white. This may have a little bit of yellow mixed in with it, and I'm painting the highlights. I'm painting where that cloud is the brightest. I want to make sure that I leave some of the shadow as well as that mid-tone of that lighter blue. When you paint things in gouache, you have three colors. You have a highlight, you have a mid-tone, and you have a shadow. And I'm showing you that here with those three colors in these clouds. The great thing about clouds, and I mention this to almost all my classes, is that clouds are completely different. So if you mess up on a cloud, nobody's going to know unless they look at your resource photo. And resource photos are only there as that. It's a resource. You're not copying it exactly. If you try to copy it exactly, you're going to get very, very frustrated. So as that paint starts to dry, I'm coming back in and adding some more of the white. I want it to be the brightest that it can. I believe this is white without a little bit of yellow mixed in. Dry brushing it just a little bit as I'm taking some of the paint directly, what would be directly from the tube. And you can see how those three values, highlight, mid-tone, and the shadow, creates a more three-dimensional look. Keep a paper towel handy. Now I'm going to dry brush, wet down my brush, dry it off with a paper towel, and then use a circular motion, and I'm trying to soften some of those edges so they're not quite so sharp. Now, do you have to do this? No. Some people like the sharper edges in the clouds. I just like to soften them so they look more misty. Again, that's wetting down the brush, drying it off with a paper towel, and then moving it around in a circular motion to soften it, to dry brush it, as we mentioned earlier. Although with this dry brushing, it does not have any paint on the brush. It's just the brush. Now that our sky is complete, let's move to creating the ground. This ground is going to create a lot of different kinds of grasses. And you will notice that the process is very similar. I'm going to start out with a yellow-green, and I'm going to cover my paper with this to stain with that color. Then I've mixed up a mid-tone. It's kind of a medium color green, a little bit darker than what I had originally. And I'm looking at my resource photo to see where the grasses and the trees are. I like to start in the background and work my way forward. And in the background, using the corner of my flat brush, I'm creating those trees that are way far in the distance. Then, working to the middle ground, I'm working to see where are those shapes of colors, as I mentioned earlier. The shapes or colors are going to give you an underpainting as you start working on detail. Working your way forward. Now I'm in the foreground. Don't worry if this is not exact, because as you move along in this painting, you can adjust, and adding detail on top of it, it's going to look completely different. There is some brighter yellows in this photograph. So I'm coming in with a brighter yellow, putting in a block of color where those grasses would be. It's a nice contrast. Making sure that you're leaving some of that darker green and the lighter green, and you have that mid-tone going. I'd like to use the corner of my brush just like I was with the clouds, but this time I'm not letting it bounce around quite as much. I'm controlling it more, and this allows me to put in just a little bit of detail as I'm going along. Giving the grass some dimension, because I have a darker value on top of the lighter value, and then you have the background color, or that wash that I created, that staining that I created, and all of those together are going to create some depth. Grass and clouds are the same in that there's no two groups of grass that are the same. No one is going to know if you messed up on how the grass looks unless they look at the resource photo very carefully. So just enjoy placing those groupings of color where you think they belong. And sometimes you're going to want to change it from what the photo looks like anyway. On top of the darker values, I'm mixing up a lighter green, and this green has yellow as well as some white in it. And you can see how I put it on top of those darker colors. You can really see it. Also notice that I have changed brushes. Now I'm using my detail brush. If you're not comfortable making this motion with your brush, you may want to take a practice piece of watercolor paper and just practice moving in an upward motion, not a downward motion. Practice is an upward motion. The other thing is to make sure if the wind is kind of blowing in the photograph you're looking at, the grass is kind of going to go in one direction, which is what is happening here. I'm having it go from the bottom up to the right. There will be other places in the painting where it's going other directions. You will also see places where there are some grasses that are mixing and going the opposite direction as well. As the grass goes back farther in the distance, it's going to get smaller. Obviously, when it's down in the background, you're not going to hardly see it at all. You're only going to see groupings of color. So that's what I did here, is I made some little strokes, but then I took my finger and smeared it a little bit so you could not see the detail. But in the middle ground, however, I can see those grass strokes. This is back in the foreground again, and these are also going towards the right. But these are obviously in a field. If you are painting grasses that are in like a yard, they're going to all be the same length. These are longer because they've had time to grow. I mixed up a yellow with a little bit of white in it as well. And now I'm going to paint some of the grass that is in that yellow section of paint. Now these are a lot smaller. The brush strokes are smaller, and notice I'm going from the top down this time because they are shorter as well as they are in the middle ground. The grass in the photograph that I'm looking at that are in this section is a lot smaller. You want to be careful when you're painting to make sure you're not overlapping what you painted in the foreground. With some pure white, I came in and adds a little bit of dots because there are some flowers, some little white flowers that are in the middle ground. Every little tiny dot represents a flower. I didn't want to overdo this because in the photograph as I'm looking at it, there weren't very many. I do want to take some of my darker green now, and I'm going to try and draw some of the stems on those flowers, checking to make sure I've got the right color. I'm using my detail brush again, and I'm once again going from the bottom up. I want to make sure these are nice and thin because they are in the middle ground. They're far away. So I'm not going to be able to see very much of that stem, just giving the impression that they are there. I got some darker green, and now I'm adding details. On this group of green over here, there were some taller weeds. They're really tall, that had some leaves on the end of them. And there were also some of those in the middle ground as well. And you can see how much smaller they are. And here is the finished painting. So when we're painting value, we're talking about using one color and creating a very, very light version of that color as well as a very, very dark version of that color. I have a rectangle of paper taped down and ready to go. And I'm painting one section of the darkest blue that I can mix up. Now I will say that this is probably a cream consistency. Then I'm going back and I'm adding a little bit more paint, but now I'm just taking my brush and just dabbing it into the white and then mixing that into the paint I have. Then, right on top of the first color, I'm making another section, but this one will be a little bit lighter. Repeating this many times. Just a dab of the white paint so that the paint becomes a lighter value, and then paint it across the top of the one you just did. Adding a little bit of water. I've noticed that my paint is getting a little bit thick. Same thing. A little more white. Notice I have not added more blue. Painting another section, going back and forth. I'm using a flat brush, by the way. Same thing, more white. The next section, The blue is lighter. It's lighter in value. Lots of paint, lots of white this time. Mixing it together. Again, I did not add more blue. And then painting my final section. You can see how we start out with a very dark blue, ended up with a very light blue. Once again, starting with a square of my paper taped down. And now I'm looking at my photo of rocks. I'm not going to draw this entire stack of rocks, but I'm going to choose several that are stacked on top of each other so I can practice painting some rocks and utilizing my midtones, my dark tones, and my highlights. When you're drawing these rocks, think of basic shapes. Look to see where the edges are and make sure you draw those as a thickness. You want these to be drawn three-dimensionally, not flat, not just a regular shape, but more like a form. Think of a rectangular prism, or think of a cube that has more than one side. For the midtone, we're going to start out with raw sienna. I'm taking the raw sienna and putting it out in my mixing tray, and then I'm adding a little bit of white to it. I'm looking at the color, and I think it needs to be darkened just a little bit. So add some of the brown. This is burnt umber. So I've taken raw sienna, a little bit of white, and some burnt umber to make the base color, to make that mid-tone that we're putting on here. And as you can see, when I'm painting it on the paper, it looks pretty good. It's not too dark and it's not too light. Making sure to paint the edges that I've put on there. Once I've finished with the midtone, I'm going to add some more white to it, and this is going to be my highlight. So I start out with my midtone, and now I'm adding my highlight. I'm going to look at my photo and see where the light is hitting it, because there's a couple edges that I want to make sure that I am placing in there. The difference in value between the midtone, the highlight, and the shadow, when we put that in there, is going to create a three-dimensionality. It's going to give it some form. Also on these rocks, there's a lot of different details that I want to put in. Adding some more of the burnt umber to make it a little bit darker. Taking that burnt umber and placing it in there to show the shadows. Once again, look for your edges, look for the corners. Rocks have various layers in them, and they're all different textures and different colors. So we're going to start putting those in pretty soon. Taking some black now and adding it to that mixture to make it even darker. And now I'm going to work on some cast shadows. So you have the shadow that is on the rock itself, but you also have a cast shadow, which is the darkest. See, this is actually it's the rock that's underneath it. But since we're not painting that rock, we're adding a cast shadow right there on the bottom. And then there's a cast shadow between the two rocks. And a cast shadow between the top rock and definitely that top edge needed a little bit more of the dark value. I'm going to add some white to it, and now I'm going to start working on some of those details I mentioned. Checking for color. Always very important to check for color before you put it down onto your painting so you know what you're going to be doing. When I'm doing these details, I haven't changed my brush at all. I'm just changing what part of the brush I'm using. If you notice, I'm using that tip. And this is kind of a very, very light value, but it's different from the light value I used previously. Lots of different values, lots of different colors in these rocks. You're just being observant and saying, okay, what else do I need to add so this looks more like the rocks I'm observing? Again, emphasizing those edges is really important. I'm doing a little bit of dry brushing to emphasize that texture that's there on the side. I have switched brushes. Now I'm using my detail brush and almost using a pure white, but this is a little bit of white mixed with some of the lighter value that I had mixed earlier. Now to create the texture, what I'm doing is I'm taking my brush and I'm kind of dotting it on the surface of the paper, and that creates a texture. This is a good technique that I use pretty much in all my gouache paintings. You're building up that layer, especially when you're working on the details. We already have the mid-tone, the highlight, and the shadow. They're there, and you can see the edges really well, but there are details that I need to add. I'm dry brushing a little bit here, taking some of that lighter value, taking my brush and going back and forth, and that creates a texture along the side. Rocks, this specific rock is not smooth. It's bumpy. And by doing that, I'm emphasizing that bumpiness along the side of the rocks. I'm looking very closely at the rocks now and seeing what else I can add to make it look more like my resource photo. Doing some more dry brushing here. When I do the dry brushing, I have paint on my brush and I put the paint down, not a whole bunch, but I put the paint down and my brush actually becomes dry and I go back and forth to kind of shade that area, to add that texture. I can even do this to add shading as far as a shadow is concerned, making it start out dark and then get a little bit lighter. I'm looking at the edges as well and seeing how there's texture along the edges to emphasize those areas. Now I'm taking some of that paint. I've switched brushes again, and this one is my flat brush and it's clean. But I have wet it down just a little bit. It's damp. And I'm dragging that paint out to kind of lighten that one corner. Getting some more raw sienna. And mixing it with some of the dark brown. Mixing it with some of the burnt umber. And not adding white to it this time. You have to be careful about how much paint you're putting on your brush. This time I'm using my round brush. And there's some really neat linear patterns on the side of this rock. So I'm taking my round brush, dabbing it on the paper, and putting in those linear patterns. When I was teaching still life to my high school students, this is the technique that I show them in just painting rocks and incorporating the patterns and designs that you see in them. Always testing the color, making sure not to use too much water. Again, every time I'm using it, this is a cream consistency. Making sure not to lose those edges, especially that edge on that main rock. If anything, putting in this texture emphasizes those edges. Notice I'm not putting any of the detail up on the top where that highlight is, that light value. Adding a little bit of white again to that mixture of the raw sienna and black. Taking my round brush, adding more textures. Being observant and looking at my resource photo to see where those bumpy places are that I can emphasize using this brush. I thought the shadow on the top was too wide, so I made it thinner just by taking that brush and painting a little bit of that lighter value. And here's my finished painting. looking at the resource photo that I chose for this rocks and mountains activity, and I'm placing in the line where that ground, the top of the mountain, meets the sky. And then there's also lower down, there's some more lines that I need to draw where the rocks of the mountains meet the forests. And that way I can delineate which colors I need to put in the different areas, because they're each going to be a different color, a different texture. So I'm starting out in the sky. I decided not to do a staining this time, but to start directly with the shadow. Since this wasn't a very large area, I thought that I could handle it without the staining. But I do have my three values mixed up. I have my darker shadow, my mid-tone, and now I'm adding my blue, and now the highlight. So your mid-tone, your highlight, and your shadow. And now I'm taking that brush and softening it, like I showed you earlier. Not putting any paint on my brush, but wiping it off and going in a circular motion that makes a misty effect. Once I did that, I noticed that there were some areas that need to be whiter. So I just took some pure white and added it to those areas where the highlights I felt need to be lighter. I mixed up some ultramarine with a little bit of black in it. And now I'm going to go in and look at those mountains and see where the shadows are. So I'm starting out with the darks first. Where are those shadows? I'm not painting the whole mountain, just the shadows. Where are the darkest areas? Now I'm mixing up a mid-tone, which is a gray. So I have my shadow, and then I have my mid-tone. And I'm looking at my photograph just to check to see where that mid-tone would be. And I'm just working on the mountain this time. Then I mixed up a white with a little bit of yellow in it. And this is where it's actually snow, but it's the lighter area. So you have your mid-tone, your shadow, and your highlight. Next, I'm going to the section down below the mountain. So you have the mountain, and then you have that next section down. It's actually part of the mountain, but this is where the trees start to grow. So I'm using the blue as the shadow. Not quite as dark as I want it, but it gives me a starting point. Then using a green. This is a green mixed with a little bit of yellow. And it looks like it has a touch of red in it as well. And that's my mid-tone. Now for the texture, I haven't put the highlights in yet. For my texture, this is adding the trees on top of that blue. I'm using my round brush, and I'm very carefully painting in some dark details where those trees are up on that mountain. This is creating what's known as a tree line. Those of you that have been in the mountains, this is a tree line. I had to make some decisions as I was going along as to what I was going to leave out and what I was going to put in, because you really have to simplify. Again, you're not reproducing the photograph exactly. Now coming in with my white and adding the snow. And the interesting thing is when I put the white on there, first you'll notice that the paint underneath it kind of mixes together and creates a lighter gray. So I come back in on top of that lighter gray and put the white. Now I'm mixing up a fir tree color. It's kind of a green mixed with a brown with a touch of red to dull the green down a little bit. And starting in with a line where that tree would be, and then adding the branches and adding the pine needles on the inside. I'm looking at my photograph very carefully and seeing how the branches are different. Some of them go down, some of them have two very close branches, and then using my round brush, kind of dancing my round brush around to create the tree. If you've never painted pine trees before, it'd be a good idea just to kind of get you a blank piece of paper, a blank piece of watercolor paper, or and just practice. Find some good photographs and practice. Working on the tallest tree now. These trees are in the foreground. And here is the finished painting. So it's time for us to review and wrap things up. I've got 3 questions for you. And don't worry if you don't know the answers. I'm going to provide those for you. So let's start out with question number 1. What is staining? If you think back to the beginning of the class, we talked about what staining was, and then we utilized it in several of the paintings that we did. So what is staining? So staining is when you cover the paper first prior to beginning the painting. Now let me just say that not all gouache artists do this, but this is the technique that I've used in this class. Number 2, what are the 3 different colors called that are used on an object? So when you're painting, there's 3 different colors or values that you'll have to mix up to be ready to paint it. What are those called? They are midtone, highlight, and shadow. For instance, when we were painting the skies and painting the clouds, we start out with a midtone, which was a medium blue color or a lighter blue, and then we painted a darker blue-gray for the shadow, and then we went to a highlight of white or a very, very light blue. Number 3, what is one of the main differences between watercolor and gouache? And if you look carefully at these 2 paintings, they might help you answer this question. Watercolor is transparent and gouache is opaque. That was one of the main differences we talked about, but there were several more. Now if you're looking at these 2 paintings, the painting on the top is a watercolor and the painting on the bottom is a gouache painting. And if you look at the trees, some of the trees in the top painting are transparent, but the trees in the bottom painting are opaque. So it's a big difference between the 2 and how you can utilize the paint. I really hope that you've enjoyed this class. I encourage you to check out some of the supplies and then try out some of the activities that we've done in this video. Have a wonderful day, and this is Barry Teghtmeyer, watercolor and gouache artist.